Picture this. It's somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, in a stretch of land we'd now call the Middle East. No cities, no calendars, no Tinder, just rock, scrubland, firelight, and two very different kinds of humans eyeing each other across a valley, both wondering the exact same thing. What is that thing, and why do I find it strangely attractive? One of them is us, Homo sapiens. Lanky, sweaty, chatty, recently arrived out of Africa with big dreams and a smaller jaw. The other is a Neanderthal. Stocky, barrel-chested, built like a fridge that could survive an ice age. Because that's literally what they'd been doing for 200,000 years. And at some point, in some cave behind some bush, in some moment history forgot to write down, these two decided that species boundaries were more of a suggestion than a rule. That decision is the reason this video exists. That decision is the reason almost every non-African person reading this right now is carrying a tiny souvenir of Neanderthal DNA in every single cell of their body. One encounter, repeated a handful of times across thousands of years, quietly rewired the genetic future of 8 billion people, and most of them have absolutely no idea it happened. So let's talk about the weirdest one-night stand in human history, and why its consequences are still showing up in your immune system, your skin, your mood, and possibly the reason you sneeze at pollen like your life depends on it. Before we get to the good stuff, let's set the scene properly, because context makes this so much funnier. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens started showing up in Africa. We were new. We were experimental. Big brains, weak bodies, a tendency to talk too much. Classic humans. Meanwhile, over in Europe and parts of Asia, the Neanderthals had already been running the place for over 100,000 years. They weren't the dumb brutes cartoons made them out to be. They controlled fire, made tools, buried their dead, possibly made jewelry, and survived brutal ice age winters that would make most modern humans cry into their heated blankets. They were, frankly, built different, literally. Their bones were denser, their muscles were stronger, and their brains, on average, were slightly larger than ours. So when small groups of Homo sapiens began wandering out of Africa somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, they weren't walking into empty land. They were walking into Neanderthal territory. Established, occupied, already lived in for millennia. Now, if you were writing this as fiction, you'd expect one of two things to happen. Either total war or total avoidance. Two different species competing for the same resources, the same caves, the same mammoths. Logically, that should end in conflict or separation. Instead, it ended in dating. For decades, scientists genuinely believed Neanderthals and modern humans never interbred. The idea was almost taboo in academic circles. Neanderthals were considered an evolutionary dead end, a separate species that went extinct around 40,000 years ago while modern humans marched on, untouched and unrelated. Then, genetics ruined the story in the best possible way. In the early 2000s, a scientist named Svante Pääbo did something that sounds almost impossible. He and his team managed to extract and sequence DNA from actual Neanderthal bones, fragments so old and degraded that most researchers thought it couldn't be done. This wasn't sequencing a fresh blood sample. This was reconstructing a genetic blueprint from fossilized bone dust that had been sitting in caves for tens of thousands of years, contaminated by bacteria, fungi, and basically every microbe that had ever walked past. It worked. In 2010, the first draft of the Neanderthal genome was published. And when researchers compared it to modern human DNA, they found something that broke the "we never interbred" theory into 1,000 pieces. Modern humans outside of Africa carry Neanderthal DNA, not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere between 1 and 2% of the genome of the average European or Asian person today traces directly back to Neanderthals. This discovery was such a big deal that Pääbo won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for it. Let that sink in for a second. A man won one of the most prestigious awards on the planet for proving that our ancestors were, to put it delicately, a little more open-minded about interspecies relationships than anyone expected. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this wasn't a one-time fling. It happened more than once, in more than one place, involving more than one now extinct human relative. Buckle up, because the family tree is about to get messy. The first major wave of interbreeding is believed to have happened shortly after modern humans left Africa, somewhere in the region of the Middle East, likely in areas like the Levant, around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. This is the encounter we're focusing on today, the original weird one-night stand that changed everything. Small bands of Homo sapiens pushing out of Africa for the first time in serious numbers ran into local Neanderthal populations who had been living in that region for tens of thousands of years already. And instead of just fighting over the good caves, some of them apparently decided to share more than territory. We know this happened because of a clever piece of genetic detective work. Every non-African population on Earth today carries roughly the same amount of Neanderthal DNA, somewhere around 1 to 2%. Populations in East Asia, Europe, the Americas, Oceania, all remarkably similar. But African populations, especially those whose ancestors never left the continent, carry very little to almost none. Think about what that tells us. If interbreeding had happened separately, over and over in totally different regions after humans had already spread out across the globe, you'd expect wildly different amounts of Neanderthal DNA in different populations depending on where and how often that mixing occurred. Instead, the consistency points to one shared origin. One population of early modern humans, mixing with Neanderthals in one general region, before that population then split apart and spread out to become the ancestors of nearly everyone outside Africa today. In other words, one encounter, or a small cluster of encounters involving a relatively small group of people, ended up being genetically inherited by essentially the entire non-African population of the planet. That's not just a one-night stand. That's a one-night stand that got forwarded to 8 billion people, like a chain email nobody asked for, except this chain email is written into your DNA and you can't unsubscribe. But it doesn't stop there, because Neanderthals weren't the only mysterious relatives we were getting cozy with. Enter the Denisovans, quite possibly the strangest human relative we've ever discovered, mostly because we barely have any of them to look at. The entire species was identified from a tiny finger bone and a couple of teeth found in a cave in Siberia called Denisova Cave, hence the name. Scientists extracted DNA from these fragments and realized they didn't match modern humans or Neanderthals. They were a third, previously unknown group of ancient humans. We still don't really know what Denisovans looked like. We have almost no skeletal information, just a name, a genome, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. It's honestly one of the wildest situations in modern science. An entire branch of humanity, confirmed to exist, confirmed to have interbred with us, and we don't even know what its face looked like. And yet, despite this near-total mystery, we know Denisovans and modern humans also got together, because their DNA shows up prominently in certain populations today, especially in Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some populations in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, where Denisovan ancestry can make up 4 to 6% of the genome. That is a massive amount compared to the Neanderthal contribution. So somewhere in the deep past, as modern humans continued migrating east and south from that original Middle Eastern rendezvous point, they ran into yet another group of ancient relatives and once again decided that species boundaries were negotiable. At this point, you might be wondering, was there literally anyone our ancestors weren't willing to interbreed with? Based on the evidence so far, the answer seems to be not really. If it walked upright, controlled fire, and could vaguely communicate, apparently it had a shot. Now, let's get back to the main event, because I promised you the weirdest one-night stand in human history, and I intend to deliver. Try to actually imagine this scenario for a second, because it's genuinely bizarre when you sit with it. You are an early Homo sapiens. You've just trekked out of Africa with your small band of family and friends. You're in unfamiliar territory. The plants are different, the animals are different, the air smells different. And then one day, you spot a figure in the distance. It looks kind of like you, but not quite. Shorter, but far more muscular, a heavier brow ridge, a wider nose, probably an adaptation for warming, frigid air in an ice age climate. No chin in the way modern humans have a chin, different proportions entirely, built low and dense for conserving heat and generating raw power. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Your first instinct, evolutionarily speaking, should probably be caution, maybe fear, maybe curiosity from a safe distance. Two different hominin species meeting for possibly the first time in tens of thousands of years of separate evolution. And yet, somehow, across countless generations, again and again, the outcome wasn't just cautious observation, it was reproduction. We will never know the actual social dynamics of these encounters. Was it a peaceful blending of communities living side by side for years? Was it something more opportunistic and situational? Was it, in some tragic cases, something far less consensual, which is a real possibility historians and geneticists don't shy away from when discussing ancient human interactions? The honest answer is, we don't know the emotional or social context of these encounters. Ancient DNA can tell us that mixing happened. It cannot tell us the story behind it. What we do know is the outcome: hybrid children, children who were part Homo sapiens, part Neanderthal, and whose descendants would eventually carry that mixed heritage across an entire planet. And here's a detail that makes the story even stranger. Genetic evidence strongly suggests this interbreeding wasn't perfectly symmetrical. Researchers studying ancient and modern genomes have found patterns suggesting that Neanderthal genetic material entered the modern human population primarily through Neanderthal fathers and modern human mothers, or at least that offspring resulting from certain pairings were more genetically successful than others. Scientists have also found evidence that many hybrid offspring, particularly males, may have faced fertility issues, a phenomenon sometimes seen when two closely related but distinct species interbreed. This is inferred from the fact that Neanderthal DNA is noticeably reduced on the human X chromosome, and Neanderthal Y chromosome sequences seem to have vanished from the modern human gene pool entirely. In plain English, some of the most persistent genetic contributions came down specific, narrower biological pathways, while other genetic material from these hybrid children was quietly filtered out by evolution over thousands of years because it caused problems. This is basically nature running its own extremely long and extremely awkward quality control process on an ancient one-night stand, deciding generation by generation what got to stay in the human genome and what had to go. Which brings us to the actual consequences, the reason this ancient hookup still matters to you personally, right now, in whatever year you're watching this. Let's start with your immune system, because this is one of the most well-documented and honestly coolest outcomes of ancient interbreeding. Neanderthals had lived in Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. In that time, their immune systems had adapted to local pathogens, bacteria, and viruses that were completely unfamiliar to newly arriving African populations. When modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, some of those already adapted immune genes got passed along. Researchers have identified specific gene variants, part of what's called the HLA system, human leukocyte antigen genes, which play a critical role in how your immune system recognizes and fights off pathogens that appear to have Neanderthal or Denisovan origin and are still present in large portions of modern non-African populations today. In some populations, these inherited variants make up a significant chunk of certain immune-related genes. In a very real sense, interbreeding with Neanderthals gave early modern humans an immune system cheat code. Instead of spending tens of thousands of years slowly evolving resistance to local diseases from scratch, some early humans got a genetic shortcut, borrowed straight from a species that had already done the hard work of surviving in that environment for hundreds of millennia. But evolution rarely gives you a benefit without a catch, And this story has a genuinely wild modern twist. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers identified a specific cluster of genes on chromosome 3 that was strongly associated with an increased risk of severe COVID-19 illness and hospitalization. When scientists traced the origin of this genetic cluster, they found it was inherited from Neanderthals. This specific variant is especially common in South Asian populations, and researchers estimate that around half of people with South Asian ancestry carry at least one copy of this Neanderthal-derived risk variant. Let that fully land for a moment. A genetic sequence passed down from an interspecies relationship that occurred roughly 50,000 years ago had a measurable, scientifically documented effect on how severely people responded to a global pandemic in the 21st century. An ancient one-night stand quietly influencing hospital admission rates during a modern pandemic. If you tried to write that into a movie script, a studio executive would tell you it's too unbelievable. Interestingly, though, it's not all bad news from that same chromosome 3 region. Some researchers have found that certain nearby Neanderthal-derived variants may have actually offered some protective benefits against other pathogens throughout history, suggesting this stretch of ancient DNA has been quietly influencing infectious disease outcomes in humans for tens of thousands of years, sometimes helping, sometimes hurting, completely indifferent to your opinion on the matter. Moving beyond immunity, let's talk about something a little more visible. Skin and hair. Several genes associated with keratin production, the protein responsible for skin, hair, and nails, trace back to Neanderthal ancestry in modern non-African populations. Some researchers believe these variants may have helped early modern humans adapt to the different climates and lower sunlight levels they encountered as they moved into Europe and northern Asia, environments Neanderthals had already been adapting to for a very long time. There's also research linking certain Neanderthal-derived gene variants to hair color, skin tone, and even the tendency towards specific skin conditions in some populations today. So the next time someone comments on your skin type or your hair texture, you now have the option to blame it on a Stone Age genetic exchange between two different species. It's a strange flex, but it's technically accurate. Now here's one that tends to surprise people. Mood and mental health. Multiple genetic studies have identified links between Neanderthal-derived gene variants and certain neurological and psychiatric traits in modern humans, including variations associated with mood regulation and increased likelihood of certain conditions like depression, as well as differences in pain sensitivity and even sleep patterns. Some Neanderthal variants have been associated with being what researchers sometimes casually describe as more of a morning person, while others are tied to differences in how people experience and respond to pain. Nobody is saying Neanderthal DNA directly determines your entire personality. Modern human psychology and mental health are influenced by an enormous number of genetic and environmental factors working together. But it is genuinely fascinating that measurable statistical associations exist between certain ancient gene variants and modern psychological and neurological traits. Somewhere in your brain chemistry, in the way you sleep or the way you process discomfort, there might be a faint genetic echo of a completely different human species. Let's talk about metabolism and fat storage too, because this one has a fascinating regional twist involving our other mystery relatives, the Denisovans. Populations that inherited significant amounts of Denisovan DNA, including certain Arctic populations like the Inuit, carry gene variants linked to fat metabolism that appear to have helped their ancestors survive extremely cold environments and diets very high in fat, like traditional Arctic diets built around marine mammals. These inherited variants likely gave early populations moving into harsh Arctic environments a genuine survival advantage, allowing their bodies to process and store fat more efficiently in a climate where that mattered enormously. Then there's altitude adaptation, and this might be one of the single most famous examples of ancient hybrid DNA, giving modern humans a direct, measurable survival superpower. Populations living on the Tibetan Plateau at extreme high altitudes where oxygen levels are dramatically lower than at sea level carry a specific gene variant called EPAS1 that helps regulate how their bodies respond to low oxygen conditions. This variant allows Tibetan populations to live and thrive at altitudes that would cause serious altitude sickness in most other humans. When researchers traced the origin of this specific gene variant, they discovered it came from Denisovans. Think about the scale of that for a second. Modern Tibetan populations, thousands of years later, quietly carrying a biological advantage passed down from an ancient interspecies relationship, an advantage so effective that it still helps them physically thrive at extreme elevations today in the 21st century, thanks entirely to genetics inherited from a completely different, now extinct branch of humanity that most people have never even heard of. At this point, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this ancient interbreeding thing sounds like it was mostly beneficial. Immune boosts, altitude survival, fat metabolism advantages. Sounds like early humans made a smart evolutionary move. Not exactly, because alongside all these beneficial traits, there's an entire category of Neanderthal-derived variants linked to less pleasant outcomes. Certain Neanderthal gene variants have been associated with increased risk factors for conditions like type 2 diabetes, blood clotting disorders, and even some fertility complications. There are also links to allergic reactions, autoimmune conditions, and, somewhat ironically, higher likelihood of nicotine addiction in some populations, based on inherited variants affecting neurological reward pathways. So while some Neanderthal DNA helped modern humans survive brand new environments and diseases, other pieces of that same ancient inheritance came along as unwanted baggage, quietly increasing risk for certain modern health conditions tens of thousands of years later. It's less like receiving a carefully curated gift and more like inheriting a mysterious old cardboard box from a distant relative, filled with a mix of genuinely useful tools and some stuff you really wish you hadn't been handed. Now, here's a detail that makes this whole story even more remarkable when you zoom out. Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA isn't just randomly scattered evenly across the entire human genome. Certain regions of our DNA are almost completely devoid of Neanderthal genetic material, what scientists call deserts of archaic ancestry. These deserts tend to occur in regions of the genome linked to critical functions, like brain development and testis function, areas of the genome that are extremely sensitive to disruption. This strongly suggests that natural selection actively worked to remove certain Neanderthal gene variants from the human population over thousands of generations, likely because those particular variants caused problems when combined with the rest of modern human genetics. Essentially, evolution ran an incredibly long-term filtering process, keeping the Neanderthal genetic contributions that worked well and slowly erasing the ones that didn't. It's almost like humanity ran an unintentional, tens of thousands of years long genetic experiment, and we're only now, with modern sequencing technology, able to read the results. And honestly, that's what makes this whole topic endlessly fascinating. This wasn't a single clean, tidy event with an obvious beginning and end. This was a messy, complicated, multi-species entanglement that played out across different regions, different time frames, and different human populations, leaving behind fragments of evidence scattered across the genomes of billions of people who have no idea any of this happened. Every time you hear a story about purebred ancient human lineages or clean, simple evolutionary family trees, remember that reality was far weirder and far more interconnected than that. Our species didn't evolve in a straight, isolated line. We evolved through overlapping waves of migration, competition, coexistence, and yes, apparently, quite a lot of interspecies attraction. Let's take a moment to really appreciate the strangeness of what we've just walked through. Somewhere around 50 to 60,000 years ago, small groups of early modern humans, fresh out of Africa, encountered an entirely different species of human that had been thriving in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years already. Instead of simply competing, avoiding, or eliminating each other, in at least some cases, these two different species had children together. Those children, and their children, and their children's children, eventually became ancestors to nearly every non-African person alive on Earth today. Later waves of modern humans expanding further east ran into yet another mysterious, now extinct human relative, the Denisovans, and did the exact same thing again, leaving behind genetic traces that still influence things like altitude tolerance and fat metabolism in specific populations today. The result is that if you are of non-African descent, somewhere between 1 and 2% of your entire genome is not, strictly speaking, purely modern human. It's a leftover fragment of an ancient interspecies relationship quietly embedded into your DNA, influencing things as significant as how your immune system responds to global pandemics and as seemingly minor as your skin tone or your sleep schedule. Every non-African human alive today, all several billion of them, is a living, breathing consequence of a genetic exchange between two different species of humans who happened to cross paths in the right place at the right time tens of thousands of years ago. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That is, quite literally, established genetic science. So next time someone tells you humans are simple, or that evolution is some clean, tidy, linear process, feel free to hit them with this. Tell them about a chance encounter in the ancient Middle East between two different species of human that somehow snowballed across tens of thousands of years into a genetic legacy carried by 8 billion people today. Tell them their immune system might owe a small debt to a Neanderthal ancestor they'll never know the name of. Tell them their sleep schedule, their skin, their fat metabolism, or even their pandemic risk profile might trace back, in some small measurable way, to an encounter between species that most people assume never happened at all. It's one of the strangest, most quietly mind-blowing facts about human existence. You are not the product of a single clean lineage marching forward through time. You are the product of overlapping, interbreeding populations of different human species, colliding, mixing, and leaving behind fragments of each other, scattered invisibly through the DNA of nearly every person you've ever met. An ancient one-night stand, repeated just enough times, in just the right place, ended up writing itself into the biological code of almost the entire modern human race. And somewhere out there, in a cave that no longer exists, in a moment nobody recorded, two very different kinds of humans looked at each other, decided species boundaries were negotiable, and accidentally became ancestors to the vast majority of humanity. If that doesn't put your last relationship into perspective, honestly, nothing will.